Welcome to my interview with Brian Livingstone. He's an economist with the School of Public Policy, and he's written a piece for the CD Howe about crude-by-rail. So welcome to the interview, Brian.
First thing I'll say, Markham, is I'm actually an engineer and a lawyer, so I'm not sure if that's better or worse than an economist.
We're not going to go there. But thank you for the clarification. All right. Now, Brian, maybe just give us an overview of the argument in your intelligence memo, please.
I'll do that. I wrote this after the budget came down last week on October 24th, but before the government of Alberta made the announcement on October 31st that they are adopting curtailment by rail, or rail over curtailment, rather. And so it's fortuitous timing, and it's obviously timely. This issue is really just the flip side of the issue that I talked with you about a few weeks ago about pipeline egress. Lack of export capacity from Alberta for production that the oil industry can produce in the province of Alberta. Most of the heavy oil goes south. That's where the refineries are located. Some of them are near Chicago. A lot of them are on the Gulf Coast. So the object of the exercise, as they used to say in the military, the objective of the mission is to get heavy oil from Alberta to the Gulf Coast and to Chicago. The pipelines are at least 3 years away. Even if TMX is completed, we all know the status of that, it's under construction, there is still a court challenge. Keystone XL may or may not be built, but neither one of those is going to be ready for at least 3 years. Meanwhile, there is more production in Alberta than there is pipeline and rail capacity to take it out. So the issue is, how do you increase rail capacity to increase export capacity so people can produce more and reduce curtailment? That is the issue that's very, very large. I listened to 2 earnings reports yesterday and today from 2 large producers. Both focus in on this issue. So that's the background. When you transport by rail, you need 4 things. You need a loading facility. You need the rail cars that we've all seen going by on the railroads, either owned by a company called Procore or Gatex. You need the railway to transport it on, which is C under CP. And you need an unloading capacity at the refinery, which is the people, after all, who buy this stuff. As we speak, there's about 310,000 barrels a day of rail that goes out. That's the NEB, now CER report for August, which is the last month that they have numbers for. It's been as high as 350,000 in the early part of this year, January and February. It dropped down to in the hundreds of, say, 150,000. Why did it do that? Because it costs about $18 a barrel, what they call full cost economics, to ship heavy oil from Hardisty, which is in Alberta, down to the Gulf Coast. It's more expensive than pipelines, which is about, give or take, about $10 a barrel. So the so-called discount, the WCS discount, narrowed from the $40 to $50 it was in November to about $10 in February. And everybody said, why would I ever ship something that cost me $18 to ship when it's only increasing value by $10? Right? Sort of economics 101. So the question then became, how do we deal with curtailment? How do we lessen curtailment? Well, we need to increase rail capacity because, as I just said a minute ago, that's the immediate fix. Pipelines are nice, they're also 3 years away. Rail we could do faster. So how do we increase or incent rail capacity to increase? Well, you can do it one of 3 ways. You can let the discount increase from the $10 I mentioned to $18 a barrel. Second, you can give some sort of financial assistance to industry from governments. Or third, you can do rail over curtailment. Now, this phrase rail over curtailment, I'll go through it if you want and explain.
Yes, please, if you would.
The question is, who's going to build new rail capacity when you can't even ship existing production in existing rail capacity because of the low discount that I mentioned? Rail over curtailment says, all right, industry, if you go out and get new rail capacity, you do all those 4 things I mentioned. You get loading facilities, rail cars, deal with the railways, and an unloading facility. If you do that, if you say get 50,000 barrels, you can reduce your curtailment, i.e. increase your production quota by 50,000 barrels. You get to keep it all. The phrase that I sometimes use is a phrase I often heard in law firms and in investment banks is that you eat what you kill. So if you go out and get your 50,000 barrels, you get to keep it all. So that's partially an incentive, and that's what the announcement a couple of days ago on October 31st was about. Actually, yesterday it was about. It was saying, if you go out and do that, industry, you get to keep all of that rail capacity. But still, you have to say rail they still have to say to themselves, companies have to say to themselves, is it still economic? Why would I spend $18 on new rail capacity when I'm only getting a $10 increase? Some of the discussion I heard in the two earnings reports I listened to today and yesterday was along the following. People said, you know, it doesn't make sense. If I've got a barrel of oil in Hardisty in a storage tank, I would never ship. I would just sell it at the existing Hardisty price. But if I have production that's shut in that I'm not shipping, and this new rail over curtailment allows me to open up that production and ship it, and produce it rather, and then ship it, I will look at the economics from what I call $0. In other words, I get a certain amount of benefits from producing it in the upstream, and then I have certain other costs that I have to incur to ship it by rail. And if I look at the end of the day and my choice is leave it shut in and don't produce, or produce it, get the revenues from that, yes, I have to pay rail costs to Gulf Coast, but I'm better off doing that than I am leaving it shut in. And I think that is the argument that you're going to see and the work you're going to see by companies in the next few weeks and months as they go through the details. And as one of the earnings reports says, the devil is in the details. But if they can see their way clear to doing that, then that's what they might do. And that would help everyone. It would help the province. They have more production, more royalty revenues. It would help the industry. They'd have more production.
So, Brian, is this rail, the arrangement you just talked about, is this going to benefit the larger companies, the integrated companies? And I'm thinking the ones that were actually opposed to curtailment, and we're thinking Husky, Suncor, and Imperial, or is it going to be the favor the big ones that supported curtailment, which is CNRL and Cenovus?
Well, I think this may be a way of threading the needle and helping both. And I'll tell you what, this is just my thought, that when the previous government said, we're going to do this, have a government do this, we're going to go out and literally lease 120,000 rail cars and make a deal with CNNCP and make a deal with the loading facility and the unloading facilities. They said, in fact, APMC would become the aggregator. And in English, what an aggregator is, it says to 10 different small producers, I will buy all of your production and make one deal with the rail companies to ship. Volume, economies of scale, in other words. So the smaller companies could say, I will get a deal by selling to APMC, and APMC will then make sure that the rail transport occurs. So I think it could benefit both. The bigger ones, you're absolutely right. They'll make a deal directly with the rail companies, but the smaller ones, no. Now, the other shoe to drop, and I say this in my note that I did with a couple of days ago that you read, is what are they going to do with all these contracts that the previous government entered into? They have not said that. When I say the Alberta government has not come out and said, here's what we're going to do. In my note, which they call an intelligence memo, that's what the CD Howe Institute calls it, which is where it was published, I said, you know, it would first of all be helpful, government of Alberta, if you basically disclose what are the terms of the deal that the previous government entered into. So they leased 120,000 cars. For how long? 2 years, 3 years? It's probably at least 3 years, because the people who build these things say, look, I'm not going to build them and then have you lease them for 2 months and then leave me high and dry because you don't need them anymore. It's like me leasing an apartment. The apartment owner says, look, Brian, you're going to have to lease it for 3 years because otherwise it's not economic and worthwhile for me to build the apartment. And I have to pay the lease payments regardless of whether I move in or not. It's what they call a take or pay contract in the upstream. So I think, and I say this in my note, I think APMC probably entered into that. And I think they also entered into not only with the people who make the cars, but also with CNNCP. And the CNNCP probably said the same thing. They said, look, we've got to go out and order some new locomotives. We may have to build a new track. We've got to reorganize our shipping because that's the way we have to run a railroad, literally. So we're only going to do that if you give us 3 years of guaranteed usage. If that's what the government of Alberta is now trying to sell to industry, first of all, why don't we understand that? Don't just tell us, you don't have to tell us all confidential terms, but just give us an understanding. And secondly, please explain why you took a $1.5 billion hit in the budget that says this is how much we're going to lose if, as and when we divest it to industry. Sorry, go ahead.
It seems to me, Brian, that in the history of Western Canada, there's this idea of government somehow helping out resource producers, farmers or wherever it might be, by being an aggregator. This is not a new idea, as I understand it. And
it was called the Canada Wheat Board, was it not?
Well, yes, it exactly was. So why is there opposition to this, or within the industry? It would seem to me that the small producers and some of the mid caps are really hurting right now, and because of this egress issue. Would the government acting as an aggregator and then using the rail capacity that at least, that seems to me to be a no-brainer. What am I missing here?
Well, I think that this almost comes down to a question of who's better to do things. And I think some people in industry say, look, if there's a need for an aggregator, somebody in the private sector will step in and fill that need. So you don't really need APMC as a government agency to do that. If there's a need for an aggregator will come forward and say to all the smaller producers, look, I'll buy your crude, your heavy oil, and then I'll put it together in one big shipment package and make a deal with the railways. So I think that's the answer to what you say, that the smaller companies, their biggest worry, I think, is, if they open up the taps and stop curtailment, it's November 2018 all over again. And $40 discount, which in English means about $10 or $15 for my barrel of WCS. And that's when smaller producers say, I can't survive financially very long if that happens. I will go out of business and become bankrupt.
So I gather that this is a, what's the word I'm looking for, but where they're balancing a number of different interests and needs here. And so is the fact that an aggregator has not come forward, is that evidence that there is no demand for it? Or is that the evidence that there isn't the capacity within the Alberta oil patch to do it? What's your take?
My take is that the reason why an aggregator hasn't come forward is because there's been no deal on the table with any rail companies yet to deal with. The real issue is in the next few weeks and months, if this rail over curtailment comes and if the province of Alberta divests these rail contracts with the people who build the rail cars and the people who, and the railways, the NCP, if they divest that all to the private sector, then somebody somewhere should say, look, an aggregator should come forward. And if it doesn't, then the private sector is not fulfilling a need. I guess my view is, and I think people who believe in markets view is, if there is a need, someone will fill it. And the market will cure that. And if you listen to a number of the different oil and gas companies, they do want to bring an end to curtailment. They don't want this to go on for months and years. Canada Wheat Board notwithstanding, they don't want the province of Alberta to be intimately involved in the day-to-day operations of their industry. And I don't think that the province really wants to. I think they did it because they felt they had to. This was not, even if I may say so, I don't think it was an ideological thing, because if you recall back in November, both parties, both the NDP and the Conservatives, UCP rather, both supported having curtailment. Now they want to say, how do we get out of it the most quickly? And rail over curtailment is one way of doing that.
I do remember Rachel Notley saying, and I think it was in this context, and it was a rather extraordinary statement for an NDP premier to say, we in Alberta believe that markets are the best answer to these kinds of things. So not something you see every day from an NDP premier. But if the aggregator doesn't come forward, what are the little companies going to do? I mean, they seem to be very vulnerable right now. We're talking about, a lot of them, I see their financial statements, their quarterlies when they come through on the wire, and lots of them are burdened with hundreds of millions of dollars of debt, and their balance sheet is in trouble. And it looks like they're on the verge of failure. Do we just let them fail, let the market fix the problem? Or should the government step in and do something?
Maybe if the government sees that for some reason, and I'm not sure why, but if nobody steps in to fill that need, no aggregator, nobody becomes an aggregator and fills the need, the government may have to revisit, and they may go back and say, well, for whatever reason, no private sector aggregator has come forward, we may have to use APMC as an aggregator, because that's in a large way, that's what APMC does. I mean, it's in the business of, as the name implies, Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission. That's what APMC stands for. So it's not like they don't know how to do this, and they wouldn't be able to do this. But I think, to be candid, that the UCP government believes that the private sector will step forward and become an aggregator for those small producers who need it.
Any final thoughts, Brian?
This is important for the people of Alberta. This is not me as a policy wonk, as I sometimes call myself, talking about abstract concepts. The need for Alberta is this, I think. Alberta is, yes, it's an oil and gas province, but it's also a project province. A lot of the benefits come from the following. Companies say, look, we think there's a resource that can be developed. Let's put together a project to develop it. It'll cost hundreds of millions of dollars because these things don't come cheap. We'll put together, we'll get a team in the office towers in Calgary to do the planning and the financing. And once we've got that all done and ready to go, then we'll go up to the yards in Edmonton, which are in Nisku and Leduc, and we'll hire hundreds, if not thousands, of trades who are earning a good wage, who are paying, their union dues because they're a union shop. And all of those people that I've described who are now employed are receiving income and paying income tax. And that, more than anything else, will help the budget and therefore the prosperity of the province of Alberta.
I think that's just to sum up. I think that's an excellent point, and it's often forgotten. Is that market egress is the biggest drag on capital investment at the moment, and if we've got 3 years of continued problems before pipelines come on and solves that market access problem, that does not bode well for the Alberta economy and for employment.
That's right.
Brian, thank you very much. I always enjoy talking to you, and we'll look forward to our next chat.
Nice to talk, Mark. Markham, thank you.